before we get going too far, I want you to know, before we can really talk about multicultural worship, and by the way, this is the title, Multicultural Worship, What, Why, Who, and How. Before we get too deep into that, well, we need to talk about foundational context. So what do I mean by foundational context? I mean, there are things we need to know about worship before we can understand multicultural worship. And there are also going to be some things that you need to know about me and my story, and I'll get into that a little bit later. But so I need to share with you some of my sort of foundational beliefs about worship. And in order to do that, I need to share with you some of my foundational influences. So I'm going to be honest with you. Here at Leadership Matrix, I am glad to be here because Leadership Matrix is a place that reminds me of a pivotal time in my life. There was a pivotal time in my life when I was at North Park University in 1999, and I saw a feature film that sort of blew my mind, and it changed the whole trajectory of sort of the way I thought about my life and the way I went about things. It was a very spiritual film to me, not necessarily to anybody else. It was also a very violent film. Of course, I'm talking about The Matrix. Now, The Matrix is my favorite film of all time. I went through a phase of my life where I didn't even call it The Matrix, I just called it The Movie. Because I'd be like, remember in the movie when they would do blah, 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 and they'd be like, what are you talking about? And I'd be like, come on, The Matrix, dude! What other movie would I be talking about? So I love this film, The Matrix. Now, how many of you have seen The Matrix and know you've seen it maybe like more than once? Anybody? Okay, all right. So most of you in the room, so you kind of know, I don't want to take a lot of time to talk about it, but one of the greatest things about The Matrix and one of the greatest scenes in The Matrix is this scene right here. Now, this is the red pill and the blue pill. Now, for those of you who haven't seen it, I'm just going to give you a really quick, like, 20-second breakdown. They're in this sort of futuristic dystopia, and there's a guy named Thomas Anderson who's just sort of an ordinary office drone worker, and he hears about some mysterious dude named Morpheus, and he thinks Morpheus may have the key to unlocking his future somehow, and so this Morpheus guy ends up getting a hold of him somehow, and so they meet in some shadowy hotel room in the middle of the night, and it's really dark and it's sort of ominous looking, and he meets Morpheus, and Morpheus tells him a little bit about something called the Matrix, and he's like, well, I don't understand what it is, and he goes, well, this is as far as I can take you. I can't really explain it any further. I have to show you, and in order to show you, you have to take this red pill. And so he gives him a choice. He says, you can take this blue pill, and if you take this blue pill, you're going to go to bed, you can believe whatever you want to believe, pretend like we never met, and go on with the rest of your life. But if you take the red pill, then I'm going to show you what's really going on, and you're never going to be the same. And so Thomas looks at it, and he's like, well, duh, I got to take the red pill. So he grabs the red pill, he takes it, his mind gets blown, the whole rest of the movie happens. Now, I love that moment. Did you like that? That was a quick wrap up. Some crazy things, bullets and computers and whatever, kung fu. But so the thing about this moment that I love so much is that the red pill moment is the moment when Neo, a.k.a. Thomas Anderson, begins to see what's really happening around him. And I remember in my life thinking to myself, you know, there's some things like that in my life where I sort of assumed things were a certain way, but then once I really started to pay attention and once someone started showing me things and once I really got engaged to what God was doing in my life, I began to, you know, sort of the scales fell off of my eyes and I began to see things as they really were. And some of them were amazing and some of them were shocking. And so I call them red pill moments. And everyone has had a red pill moment at one point or another in their life. It might have been, you know, the end of the film, or it could have been a relationship that you thought really didn't mean anything, and then something tragic happens, and you realize, oh my gosh, this person means so much to me, and I had no idea, or you know, whatever. I call those red pill moments because, like I said, I love the Matrix, so everything in my life eventually makes its way back to the Matrix. So we're going to talk about some red pill moments. Now, how many of you have ever seen one of these? This is a UPS truck. Okay, obviously. Now, I had my own red pill moment once, and if you're new, you want to grab one of those handouts that are in the back table. I had a red pill moment once where, you know, I, like you and like anybody else, have seen these UPS trucks dozens and dozens of times. And I was with my wife once, and we were at a downtown Seattle high-rise hotel, and I was on the 14th floor, and I think it was like our anniversary. I probably should know that before I start talking about it, but we were together for some special event. So we were in this hotel, and I was looking down at the city, and just marveling at the view. And I noticed something really interesting. So when you look at a UPS truck, you see that it's brown, and you see, the front is brown. You see kind of the brown uniforms, and if it's a black guy driving, the brown driver. It's like all this brown is like the main theme here. Matter of fact, even a couple years ago, they had this whole advertising campaign. It's like, what can brown do for you? So you could they were getting behind this whole brown thing. They want you to think, when you see UPS, you see brown. Brown truck, brown driver, brown boxes, everything's brown. Well, standing in that hotel room looking down, I noticed something really crazy. The whole thing is not brown. The top is white. And I was like, what? That's weird. And I was standing, we were like gonna leave to go somewhere, and I was just standing looking at it at the window, and my wife Holly, she was with me, she wanted to go to another presentation, but so she's standing and she's like, what's wrong? And I'm like, look at that UPS truck. It's white at the top. And she was like, and I'm like, I didn't know. I thought it was all brown, and it bothered me. I pulled out my phone and I started researching. I'm like, why are the tops of things white? Apparently, it's not like white paint. It's like a translucent plastic so that natural light can get in, so that the drivers can see what they're doing and they don't have to pay for electricity to shine a little light on the thing when there's the sun. The sun is much brighter than any little light you could shine in there. So that's why those tops of those things are white. And this is a really small thing, but I'm telling you, in that moment, I was like, I had no idea. Because I'd just been assuming all these years that UPS trucks are brown all over. Well, they're not brown all over. Now, that was just a small example of a red pill moment for me. And like I said, all of you had some, but if we had more time, we could probably sit and hear from many of you, and you would tell really interesting, harrowing, heartbreaking, or heartwarming tales of your assumptions being challenged. But I want you to understand that's what I mean when I talk about a red pill moment. So we're going to talk about some red pill ideas about worship. These are ideas that challenge conventional wisdom or conventional ideas of what worship really is. And we're going through this because you have to remember, before we can talk about multicultural worship, we have to talk about worship. Because if you don't understand what worship is, then you're never going to get a handle on what multicultural worship is. So I'm going to take you through a couple of, remember, this is all foundational context. So I'm going to take you through some red pill ideas about worship and what it is and what it's not and why that matters and all that. So if you're with me, give me a nice little head nod so I know we're all together. Okay, great. So let's move on. First one is worship is more than music. Worship is more than music. Now, let's be honest. For a lot of you, that one was, duh. Of course, we know that. But I say that only because when we're talking about multicultural worship, culture influences a lot of different things. And music is a huge part of culture, but it's not all of culture. And so we just kind of need to establish that as a baseline. So I don't need to break that down any further. We all have heard that. We know worship is lifestyle. And we're good? Yes? Yes. Okay, great. There are some moments when I need you to actually say something, because otherwise I don't really know, or give me some kind of a sign. So. Duh. Yes. Exactly. Duh. Right. So moving on. Worship is more than music. Second red pill idea. Worship is less of a feeling and more of an active choice. Now this one took me a long time to really wrap my head around. But I noticed something. If you go into the Bible and you go on a Bible Gateway and you search the word worship and all the hits that come up in the Old Testament for worship, they're not sort of the kind of feely moments that we associate with having worship. Like in church, sort of conventional wisdom says, the worship music was just great and the Spirit of God fell and I just really felt drawn and swept up in the moment and I really worshiped the Lord. Well, in the Old Testament, worship a lot of times had nothing to do with feeling and everything to do with active choice and obedience. Now, who's got Genesis 22:5? Okay, let's hear Genesis 22:5.
He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship and then we will come back to you." Okay,
we will worship and then we will come back to you. Now, this is Genesis 22. Does anybody know what's happening in the story when this happens?
Isaac being sacrificed.
Yes! Yes! In Genesis 22, this is a man. Abraham was just told by God to go up and give a sacrifice. And God had told him basically in no uncertain terms, that sacrifice is going to be your son. So you're going to need to bring your son with you and go up to the mountain and worship me in this way. By offering up your son. Now, I don't know about you. I don't have any kids yet, but I can imagine that Abraham didn't feel like worshiping in that moment. I imagine that was a difficult choice for him to make. But that was his choice. And he made it. And God honored that. And we know the rest of the story. There was a ram in the thicket. Whew, hallelujah. And, you know, it was all good. They could really worship. But you see my point here. In conventional church, we often think of worship as being about emotions and thought and getting swept up in the moment. No. Worship is about a choice. I'm going to worship, and it may look like this, or it may look like that. It may involve this choice, or it may involve this action, or it may involve this point of obedience. But I want us to really get that. Worship always involves an active choice. Third red pill moment, or red pill truth about worship. True worship moves us beyond ourselves. Now, who's got John 4, 28 through 30? Okay, let's hear it.
The woman then left her water pot, went her way into the city, and said to the men, "Come, see a man who told me all things that I ever did. Could this be the Christ?" And they went out of the city and came to him.
Okay, now, who knows? Do we know who this woman is in the story? Okay, this is the Samaritan woman, this woman at the well. And Jesus comes and meets this woman, and they have a conversation. And here's something very interesting. In the course of their conversation, which I don't really have time to break down, but most of us have probably heard this story. In the course of the conversation, Jesus said some very hard things to her. As a matter of fact, he was tactful about it, but he kind of revealed some things about her and her husband and who she was living with and all that kind of stuff. And I mean, I don't know about you, but if I had an interaction with someone where they were, you know, gentle, but they kind of were able to sort of lay all my darkest secrets bare like that, I wouldn't be so excited to then run out and talk about it. I'd be like, that's great. I'm going home now. Goodbye. But no, this woman actually said, hold on, you guys, no, you need to come see this man. This is, you need to come see this man. And I don't know about you, but I believe that part of what happens when we really engage in worship is it helps us take our eyes off of our own issues, off of our own desires, off of our own preferences, and helps us get beyond ourselves to serve somebody else. Because this woman could have said, wow, Jesus, that was amazing. Call me back if you have any more, and I'm going to go home. But she knew that it was so impactful in her life that she thought, somebody else has got to experience this. Somebody else has got to meet this man. And if it means me risking someone knowing something else about my past that honestly I'd rather keep quiet, that's okay, I'm going to do that. Because I want to worship this man. Worship, true worship, moves us beyond ourselves. And you notice in that same passage, this is when Jesus talks about worshiping neither on the mountain nor in Jerusalem, but worshiping in spirit and truth. I believe it's no accident that that was a part of that passage. I believe that Jesus, in addition to saying something about discipleship and about sin and forgiveness, I believe he was teaching us something about worship in that passage. So true worship moves us beyond ourselves. And here's the last red pill idea. True worship is inherently countercultural. Inherently countercultural. Who has 1 Peter 2, 9 and 10? All right, let's hear it.
But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy.
I love that. I love that passage. There's some really huge words in there. There are chosen, special. If you're reading in the King James, I think it says set apart. And then you know, he talks about once you were like this, but then this happened. You used to be this way, but then this happened. And that changed your identity. And I believe that part of our identity as Christians should be a little different, a little off from the rest of the world. Now, I know that's not shocking to you, but the reason why I say this is that I think sometimes in churches, and depending on where we are in our community and what our church looks like and what part of the country and all that kind of stuff, sometimes the idea of going to church and belonging to a church community gets really sort of conflated with the idea of being socially responsible and being respectable. And we have this idea of the good church-going person. That's one of the things that's nice about being actually in the Pacific Northwest, is we know that not everybody thinks that way. But the truth is, I believe that's a big part of our identity. And so when we worship, there's something inherently different about it, which, to be honest, if we were to all be really honest, if we grew up in church, that's probably why we weren't always inviting our friends to church, right? Because if you're in high school, you're in middle school, like sometimes the last thing you want to do is stick out. You're just trying to fit in. But what we're hearing here from 1 Peter is, if you're really going to worship, if you're really going to do this Jesus thing, you're going to be weird. That's just going to be a part of how it is. And you got to own that. You got to understand that. So that's the fourth red pill idea about worship. Now, those are sort of my baseline foundational beliefs about what worship is. And so now we need to talk about multicultural worship. So if we've talked about what worship is, now we should talk about multicultural worship. And the first thing people always ask me when they hear that I'm talking about multicultural worship is, what is it? And I never know exactly how to answer that question. And here's one of the reasons why. Because multicultural worship is an umbrella term, and it means a lot of things. Now, what do I mean by this? I mean, some people, they might have their worship songs that they sing, and then the Spirit of God moves on them, and they're reaching a group of people that normally come to the church, and God leads them to sing that same song in a different language. That could be multicultural worship. Or it could be that someone else joins the worship team, and instead of singing that song with the guitar, they're going to sing that song with a piano and an organ, or just an organ. Or it could be, a church that was more traditional, and they had, the big pipe organ, and they're going to do some of these hymns, but instead being the pipe organ, they're going to do, with a guitar or whatever. All of these things can be encompassed within the idea of multicultural worship. And so I want you to understand something. When I'm talking about multicultural worship, and you hear a lot of people talk about multicultural worship because, let's be honest, it's starting to become a thing and people are talking about it. We're not all talking about the same thing. You need to understand that. And that's really important. And so you got to get that. And then here's the other thing. Multicultural, the reason, sorry, you can tell I'm getting excited because I have like 8 things I'm trying to say all at once. And they're like, so I'm going to slow down. I'm going to calm down. And I'm going to tell you the next thing, which is that multicultural worship has to do with culture. Culture is at the center. And culture touches on all sides of the diversity wheel. Now, this is a diversity wheel. If you go on Google and you do a Google image search for diversity wheel, you're going to come up with like a bunch of different diagrams. But they're all sort of look a little bit like this one. I just picked this one because it's the one I liked and because I could fit the word culture in the middle. But when people talk about a diversity wheel, if you do if you've ever done a corporate training on diversity, or if you've ever taken a university course that has to do with diversity, this idea of the diversity wheel is very prevalent. And the reason why is because when you look at the diversity wheel, there's a lot of things going on. When most people hear the word diversity, they think skin color, or they think ethnicity. But if you look at the diversity wheel, there's a lot of stuff going on there. There's race, there's your socioeconomic background, there's your educational background, there's your physical ability. Do you need to use a cane, or are you in a chair, or do you have all use of your limbs? And there's your age, your gender identity, your work experience, what you've been doing for a job. All of those things filter and touch on this idea of our culture, and our cultural identity. And again, I have to say that it's important that we understand this, because again, multicultural worship is not just about having some people who are brown or who look a little different being involved in your church service. Now, obviously, I'm a big advocate of brown people, since I am one. But I want you to get this idea. The multicultural worship is a big umbrella term, and it touches on culture, and culture is a big deal. And part of the reason why I'm hitting that so hard is because when I started doing some work and some research, and I mean, even research is probably too strong of a word, but when I started really looking into this more deeply, I started becoming astounded by the different ways that people went about multicultural worship. Because there were so few people that I knew at the time doing it, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about my story a little bit later, but at the time when I was sort of growing up and then learning how to become a worship leader, there were so few people doing it that I sort of kind of assumed that, you know, if you're doing multicultural worship, you're sort of doing it like me. And little did I know I was in for a rude awakening. Now, I'm going to show you a book. This is a great title, and I recommend this book. It's called Worship Across the Racial Divide. And this is a sociological book. It's not necessarily a theological or like a Christian self-help book. It's primarily sociological. And what I mean by that is Gerardo Marti is, I believe, a sociologist and, well, I don't know what all his titles are, but he's really interested in this idea of worship and identity. And so here's what he did. He traveled all across the state of California and spoke to churches and church leaders who operated successful, thriving, multi-ethnic churches. Now, in this kind of dialogue, the standard definition for whether or not a church is multi-ethnic is there at least 20% of the church's membership or attendance of a non-dominant cultural identity or ethnicity. So it doesn't mean, you know, you've got a whole United Nations thing. It just means, do you have kind of like a solid critical mass? Do you at least have 20% of the people going to your church that are different from the rest of the 80? So by that sort of definition of being multi-ethnic, he started talking to all these different multi-ethnic church pastors and particularly worship leaders. And remember that these are churches these aren't just like churches that are like church plants that exist in the minds and hearts of, you know, some well-meaning, you know, passionate church planters. These are existing churches that have been existing for many years, some of them, and he basically just asked them, well, he asked them a lot of things, but one of the things he asked them was, what is your approach to how you pick your music? Because he was very interested in this idea of how does our cultural identity tie into the way we do worship music at church? And so in answering that question and others like it, he gathered a bunch of data and it became this book. Now, one of the things I noticed in this book is that in answering that particular question, he found a lot of different answers and he found a lot of different approaches. And so he put together this what do we call it? It's a matrix. It is a matrix, a very simple one. This grid, quadrant grid, that's what I was trying to say. He put together this quadrant model. And you've all kind of seen quadrant models, so you know how this works. But on one side, you have how much musical variety is there, and on another side, he has how much racial awareness is there in the church. And so as he heard all these different answers, he was filtering them primarily into one of these four characteristics. Now, the first model for multicultural worship music is what he called the Professionalist Model. Now, the Professionalist Model has high musical variety, but low racial awareness. And essentially what the Professionalist Model says is, we don't really see race here in this church. We're colorblind. But whatever music that we do, we want to do it as to the best of our ability, as humanly possible. We want to be excellent. Excellence is the rallying cry of the worship leader who operates under the professionalist model of multicultural worship. So that's one way to think about it. We're not talking about race. We're just doing music as good as we can, as best as we can, as whatever. Now, the funny thing about this to me is, when I think about this model, I think, well, actually, that could be very multicultural, because if you're going to be excellent at music, many of the most excellent musicians draw from many musical backgrounds, don't they? You can be a fantastic country singer and only do country music, but you can do country that's got a little influence of this, a little bit of that. Same thing with hip-hop. You can be a fantastic hip-hop artist, but if you're going to be an excellent hip-hop artist, you're going to borrow from other musical translations, or musical traditions, excuse me. So that's the Professionalist model. Now, there's something called the Traditionalist model. The Traditionalist model is low musical variety and low racial awareness. So the Traditionalist model essentially says, well, I'm the pastor, I'm the worship leader, this is the kind of music that I like, this is the kind of music that stirs my heart, this is the kind of music that the people here generally like, it's sort of what we've always done, and so this is what we're going to do. And we do it, and people of varying cultures come to our church, and they connect with it, and so that's our model. And I've seen and heard churches that do this and do it well. And it's not necessarily my choice, but I can understand how it can still work, and it can still be multicultural. Here's a third quadrant. Assimilationalists. The assimilationalist model is low musical variety and high racial awareness. Now, what the assimilationalist model says is, look, we know we can't please everybody, but we're going to pick a style that we think pretty much everybody can get with. It might not be their favorite thing in the world, but they can still enter in, they can still connect, and we can get a lot of different kinds of people to really worship if we do this one style. So we're going to do this style, and we're going to expect everybody to kind of come along with that. That's the assimilationalist model. And now the fourth quadrant, the fourth model approach is what we call the pluralist model. Now the pluralist model says, you know, sort of like Paul said, we're going to try to be all things to all people because it's high musical variety and high racial awareness. So the pluralist model says, okay, if we have some brown Latino people in our congregation, we're going to try to do some brown Latino music. We got some African American people, we're going to try to do some gospel. If we have some white people, we're going to try to do some pop rock. If we have some, you know, some alternative, you know, sort of emo kids, we're going to try to do some alternative emo music. We're going to kind of put everything we can in there to sort of mix and match and make sure everybody is sort of addressed. And that can be successful. It can be very difficult, but that's one approach. Now, as I've talked to many of my friends who do multicultural worship ministries in churches or in bands, most people aren't strictly one of these. I found that most people are a combination of one or the other. Because like I said, these are just models. These are sort of generalizations. So like for me, I'll just be honest with you. My approach is sort of halfway between pluralist and assimilationist. Because I know I can't do everything. I can't please everybody. And so I have a certain style that I rock with. But at the same time, I try to be intentional and I try to broaden my own tastes and my own perspectives enough so that, that I can do other music that's not necessarily my favorite, but I can do it fairly well, and I'm sort of getting ahead of myself. But I'm just giving you an example that these are all four different approaches to multicultural music. And I think it's really great that we see all of these as legitimate examples, because some of you may think, well, our church isn't multicultural because we only do one kind of music. But if you go back to the diversity wheel, you might be multicultural and you didn't even know it, right? Because you might have people from different backgrounds in terms of their socioeconomic sphere. You might have people who are coming from different church origins. So you might have, you know, a former Lutheran and, you know, and someone who grew up Catholic and someone who grew up charismatic, and they could be all on the same worship team worshiping. That could be a miracle all by itself. Right. So it's important to understand that there are many ways to do multicultural worship music well. However, usually, I don't know about you, but for me, if I'm trying to do something really well and I'm trying to capture exactly what it is, I need a definition. So I'm going to give you my definition, and I want to, what's the word I'm trying to say? I want to emphasize that this is just my definition, but I think it's a pretty good one. So here's my definition of multicultural worship. It is worship that honors God through the voices and cultures of many people groups. I use the word many for a reason. 2 is many. It's twice as many as 1. You know, but 40 is also many, and so is 3. And I want us to be able to, when we think about this idea of multicultural worship, sort of free our minds from what our, whatever assumptions you may have had walking into this. Because one of the things I believe, and this is not a part of my notes, I'm just kind of feeling really led by God to say this, I believe all of us can walk in a mode of multicultural worship. I believe we can. I'm not only passionate about it in the sense that I want to show people what it is, but I really want to empower people to do it. And so we're going to talk about why. Well, why should you do it? Because, I mean, you know, the answer shouldn't be because I was at Leadership Matrix and I saw Jelani present. He was really funny, so we're going to go with this. You know, that's not going to fly at your church. At least I hope not. So we're going to talk about why. Why should you do multicultural worship? And here's the first answer. And if you don't get anything else, you should get this. Because it's biblical. Okay, because it's biblical. Now, who has Acts 2, 5, and 6? Let's hear it.
Now there were dwelling in Jerusalem Jews, devout men from every nation under heaven. And at this sound, the multitude came together, and they were bewildered, because each one was hearing them speak in his own language.
Right. Now, I don't know about you, but if I would have been there, I would have been like, whoa, this God is amazing. Because this guy speaks this, and this lady over here speaks this, and I speak this, and I can hear all of them. And we're all praying and worshiping together. Now, it says later on in the text that they were sort of praising, God and his marvelous works. And I can't state this enough, that when we talk about multicultural worship, the truth is we're not talking about some new thing that just originated. Really, what we're doing is we're talking about worship, but we're talking about it in a more authentic way as it actually happened in the Bible and actually happens here. So I talk about multicultural worship in order to differentiate from what happens at a lot of churches, which is not to say that those other churches aren't worshiping, but I want you to sort of change your mindset from multicultural worship as sort of this nice special niche thing that a couple of people can really do well, to multicultural worship is biblical worship. That's the first thing. And honestly, if that's all you get, if you don't remember anything else, you don't remember my name, but you get that, whew, I've done my job. So I really want you to grasp onto that. And that is what I call the scriptural reason, because it's biblical. Duh. Bible scriptural. Okay, now here's a more practical reason. Why should you do multicultural worship? Because it moves us beyond ourselves. Now, I talked about this earlier with the woman at the well, but here's the truth. And this is a practical reason. When you're in a church, and I know many of you are church leaders, I know that it can be very difficult to get people beyond what they want, where they want it, what they're used to, and so on and so forth. And as pastors, as worship leaders, there's a fine line. If you were here this morning for I'm forgetting his name. No. He was in this room. Pringle. Nick Pringle. I'm sorry, Nick. I totally forgot your name. But Nick's presentation was all about Sunday school and becoming more intergenerational. And one of the things that he found out is that it's really hard to change people's expectations, because basically he kind of canceled Sunday school and then faced sort of an armed revolt about it. And so I'm only bringing that up to say that as church leaders, it can be challenging to find ways to challenge people's expectations and to help people get beyond themselves, but in ways that can be really palatable and that people can get behind. And I believe that having a multicultural approach to worship music is one of those things that helps. Because when you start drawing from different approaches, from different cultural influences, when you start speaking different languages and doing different music styles, I'm going to be honest with you. Some people are going to be like, that's great. And other people are going to be like, yeah, I don't know about that. But if we're really about being people who raise up disciples, people who believe in the power of laying down our life and picking up the cross, people who really believe in doing what Paul said in Philippians 2:3, which is valuing other people as more important than ourselves, then multicultural music is a great way to model that from up front. Because if you're truly doing multicultural music in your worship service, part of what you're saying is, hey, guess what? It's not all about you. It's also about this other person who maybe doesn't get their needs met, or it doesn't have their back scratched so much by the music we normally do. So we're going to do a little bit of something else, and it's going to be a blessing to them. So that's a very practical reason. And then here's, since I just gave you, sort of a selfless, Christ-like reason, I'm going to give you the selfish reason. Because it's fun. It really is. It's fun. And I'm a witness to that, but I've also seen that played out in other people. I have many friends who are not worship leaders, who are not, on the big multicultural worship train, but when they come to an event and we do some song in a different language they've never done, they go, oh, that was cool. And it's like, I can't speak Spanish, but now I can sing some Spanish. I can say Gloria a Dios. I can say Santo. You know what I mean? It's like, it's fun. And I don't know about you, but I think as a worship leader, if we can do as many things that are fun in our worship services, that's good. Because a lot of times worship becomes a drag, becomes just sort of a rote thing. So those are three basic reasons. It's biblical, it helps people get beyond themselves, and it's fun. So let's talk about the last two. We need to talk about the who and the how. We've talked about what it is. We've talked about why to do it. We need to talk about who and how. Now you'll notice something The name of this presentation is Multicultural Worship, What, Why, Who, and How. The who and the how are together. And I did that for a reason. In order for me to really explain how that works, I need to tell you a little bit more about my story. So, let me tell you about my story. Now, those of you who know me, or you've seen me at some event, you probably know my dad is a pastor, Pastor Henry Greenidge. He founded Irvington Covenant Church over 20 years ago in Northeast Portland. And that was that was my most foundational church experience. And growing up in that church, we were first a church plant, and then, sort of in the late 90s, we got our own building. And growing up in that church, I experienced multicultural worship every week as a norm. It was the first covenant church that was intentionally planted to be multi-ethnic, to my knowledge. And there were some things about that that were really fun. There were some things about that that were really rough, and I don't really want to get into that. But I want you to know that I was a product of that. So when I talk about multicultural worship, this is not something that I just, Googled like 5 years ago and decided I was going to base my life about it. This is, I was literally born into it. If you know about my family's full of musicians and worship leaders and people who are very active in music and church ministry. And so this is part of my lifeblood. But I want you to know something. Just because you are part of a family that does something, that doesn't mean that you're going to do it well. And I'm going to give you an example of this. So, I lived in Chicago. My wife Holly and I had just been married, and because of some things that happened, including the primary worship leader at Irvington Covenant at the time, who was my aunt Grace, she passed away from breast cancer. And so there was sort of a big open question as to who's gonna be the next worship leader. And so my wife and I, we decided to move to the Portland area. It was back to Portland for me, but for Holly, it was new to her because she'd grown up in the Midwest. And so we moved to Portland in 2005, primarily for the purpose of me beginning to become and sort of be groomed into the next worship leader at this church, this sort of iconic, very important flagship church. It was my dad's church, and it was a really big deal. Well, as you can imagine, there was some drama. There was some hardship. There were budget constraints. There were hard decisions that had to be made. And over the course of about 4.5 years, when I came to the church, I was sort of the main worship leader, but I was really only the vocalist, so I was singing and helping to pick the songs, but there were 3 other musicians that were also on staff. There was a full-time youth pastor, the pastor was full-time, and there was another full-time church person, sort of admin person. And so we went from that over the course of about 4.5 years to first the other 3 musicians got cut because of money reasons, and then the youth pastor's position got eliminated, and then, I forgot to say, the associate pastor at the time, who was my Uncle Paul, he was the previous music director, and he had become associate pastor, so he had been on staff. And so when I first came in and was in a place of leadership, it was really a shared leadership, and I was sort of kind of leading a group and not really knowing how to do it, to be honest with you. But that was sort of the situation I got thrown into. Well, one by one, all these people were sort of pulled away. And the one that was hardest for me was my Uncle Paul, because in addition to being the associate pastor and former music director, he was also the primary pianist. And if you know anything about gospel music, you know that gospel music is run by the keyboard player. And my Uncle Paul is a phenomenal musician. Phenomenal musician. If you've ever heard of the singer James Ingram, my Uncle Paul was James Ingram's music director, and he traveled overseas, all over the world for about 5 or 6 years in the mid to late 80s. And so this was the guy who was not leading worship, but who was the primary music director while I was a worship leader. Well, when he left, there wasn't nobody else to play but me. And at that point in my life, I had only been playing piano for about 4 or 5 years. And I was nowhere near his skill level. I mean, not even close. I could play. I could, do a little bit. But if you know anything about gospel music, sometimes gospel music can be really complicated. Got a lot of 7th chords and a lot of really dense, interesting and difficult progressions. And I was, expected to follow him up. And I was just kind of like, okay, Lord, I'm going to do this, but man, I don't know. I'm going to be honest with you. I thought about quitting right then and there. Because I'm like, I can't do what he does. And people in the church, there were a lot of people in the church who at that time really connected with our church because of the worship. And the worship music and the worship ministry had become a huge part of the identity of the church. And so they were sort of looking at me like, you're the next Greenidge in line, let's go. And I was like, ah. So here's what I did. And I'll be honest with you, I wasn't doing this intentionally at the time, but as I look back on my life, I realized this was like a David moment for me. Now, if we go back in the Old Testament, we all know the story of David and Goliath. You know, we've heard it in Sunday school, whatever. The thing about David and Goliath is, if you go back to the story, everybody expected David to put on the big armor and grab the sword, right? Because they were like, that's what a warrior does. And he was like, yeah, try that. It don't fit right. The sword's all heavy. And, you know, makes my underarm stink, and I'm too, you know, I can't do it. It's not working for me. So he said, here's what I know how to do. I got these stones. I got the slingshot. I'm going to roll with that. I'm going to pray to the Lord and see what God does with that. So I was sort of in the same situation. Now, at the time, I was very active in music ministry, but not in worship music ministry. I was very active in hip-hop music ministry. And so I knew how to make beats. I knew how to mess with drum machines. I knew how to deal with sort of the electronic side of music. But I wasn't really all that like practiced in terms of playing a piano in a worship service and get people to really worship and lift their hands and do that whole thing. So I said, well, you know what? Maybe if I start just programming a few things in the worship service, just putting together a few beats and like a little bass line or something. Because here's the other thing. In addition to all these cuts and all these staff people that were leaving, our band was like down to almost nothing. So we had like a drummer and a guitarist sometimes. Or actually, no, it was the guitarist that was real, you know, he was on point all the time. But the drummer was kind of iffy. And so I was like, we don't have a band, so we need some way to have a fuller sound. And so I started programming with the keyboard that the church had at the time, tracks for our worship services. And it started with 1 or 2 songs. And then as I tried those songs out and people kind of went, oh, that's sort of a different sound. Okay, I guess we'll roll with that. And I learned a little bit more about how Paul, you know, plays his chords. And I couldn't play them as fast as he could in real time, but I knew what they were and I knew how to program them in. And I was like, let the computer do the work. Hallelujah. And so I started rolling with that. And I started doing these tracks. Well, that was about 2009. And so over time, God started revealing to me that this is part of my calling. And I realized that it was part of my calling because once I started doing this, and I started getting pretty good at it, and people in the church, you know, it was sort of a gradual change, but they were starting to kind of go with it. And, you know, they were like, okay, you know, we'll give Jelani a shot here, and we'll see what he does with this MIDI thing. Well, what started happening is that people got used to it. But then when I needed to be gone, like for midwinter or some other kind of conference, and I would say, hey, so-and-so, can you lead worship for me? And they would go, I can sing, but I can't do that thing you do with the tracks. That's weird. I'm not messing with that. And I would always tell them, I'd be like, no, it's not that hard because I programmed it all in there. You really just kind of just pressing a few buttons, and they're like looking at me like, I don't do that Harry Potter stuff. You know what I mean? It was like, you got the magic with the keyboard and the faders, and I just, that's not me. And at first I thought it was just, you know, well, I asked a few people because I thought maybe they were a little bit older and they were kind of, you know, not that conversant. But I would talk with younger people and people who are my age and people who love music and who knew a little bit about it. And they were just like, I don't know how to do that. That's weird. I mean, I like that you do it, but I can't, don't ask me to do that. So I started getting online. Well, is anybody doing this? And I didn't find anybody who did. So the Lord started saying to me, you need to teach people how to do this. And so for me, that was a huge moment where the light sort of went on and my brain kind of went, and I went, okay, I'm going to show people how to do this. Now, part of the reason why I'm telling you all this now is because I would not have been able to do that if I would not have grown up playing underneath my dad and my Uncle Paul. My dad and my Uncle Paul were two huge influences for me. And even though they didn't have this great idea of, hey, you should teach worship leaders how to use tracks in worship. You should call it motif worship and blah, blah, blah. But they were huge influences for me. And so the way that I learned how to do worship from a technical and musical standpoint was by being with them. The who and the how went together. And so I want you to understand, well, actually, before I even get back into my point, let me continue, give you a little bit more of my story. And I know we have about another 10 or 15 minutes left, so I want to give some time for Q&A, because I know I said I would give time for that, but I need to tell you this next part. So right around in 2009, remember in my story, this was kind of when I started making that transition to tracks. And this is when my life was getting really, really hard, because I was getting more and more responsibilities. And to be honest with you, this was also a period of my life that I felt very isolated, because I felt like people liked what I did, but they didn't really understand it. And at the time, I wasn't really getting paid that well for it. I was working officially quarter time, but really working between 25 and 30 to 32 hours a week. And it was really hard for me. And at the time, somebody told me that there was this conference happening in New Orleans, and it was like one of those email forwards that I thought was like a joke or something. And it was like a friend of a friend said, hey, you should go to this conference. And I was like, what is this about? And I don't have time to tell you the whole thing of how it happened, but somebody ended up donating some money for me to fly out to New Orleans to go to this conference. And it wasn't even really a conference. It was just sort of an informal gathering of worship leaders. Well, I went to this thing. And I'd never been to New Orleans before, and I didn't know any of these people from anybody. And I was late, too, because I went to the wrong hotel in downtown New Orleans. And so I busted in the room, and they were like in a circle just sort of giving their name. And I'm like, I'm Jelani, and I'm late, and I do worship with the keyboards and tracks, and it's hard, and help pray for me. You know, that's kind of what I came in, doing and saying. And it was like a 2-day conference. And I remember at the time being on the plane saying, Lord, whatever you want from me in this conference, I'm just going to get it. I'm just going to receive it. And I ended up talking with about 18 other worship leaders who had been gathered from other multi-ethnic churches. And it was strictly for the purpose of praying for one another, hearing each other's stories, and just learning. And just, people would call that networking, but it wasn't like a big professional thing. It was just being together. And that was so transformational for me. Because at that time, I had never really been around a group of other worship leaders who were doing this kind of work. I had hardly met anyone in the Portland area that was doing it, and the only other people that I really knew about were in my family, and I mean, they're great, but it's my family, it's not the same thing, you know what I'm saying? It was really hard. And so I was just so like, when I met these people, I was just like, oh my gosh, can I just, live with you all and like have you be my friends? And and there were about 4 or 5 of us that were all feeling the same way, like, oh my God, this was huge, this was amazing. And so one of them said, well, I don't know what we're going to do from here, but I know I want to hear from you guys again. And so are there any of you that just want to stay connected? And so we formed this email group. It was 5 of us. And we sort of stayed in contact. And the long story short is that we became sort of this loose conglomeration that has become a resource now. And have any of you heard of Mosaics Global? Any of you know about Mosaics Global? Mosaics Global is an organization that is about the propagation of multi-ethnic church. And so it was Mosaics Global that had got these worship leaders together. And so we were like, well, let's do something like Mosaics, but for worship leaders. And so we started this thing. We're called the Multicultural Worship Leaders Network. And the reason why I say all of that is because so many of the songs and the techniques and the tips about language and the recommendations and the hard stories and the questions of what should I do when I've got this, I'm not just making those things up as I go along. I'm calling these guys and I'm saying, where have you guys had success? What's one song that has been going great for you that really helps people to get over their fear of singing in a different language or whatever it is? And I started to find that this was a big resource for me. And it wasn't just a resource that was an informational resource, it was a relational resource. And then I started thinking back, I was like, people think that I'm pretty good and talented, but as I think back, a lot of the different music that I've learned and songs and techniques that I've embraced over the years, those were all as a result of relationships. I got to play with the Chick Band in 2003. You know why I got to be part of the Chick Band? Because I knew Matt Lundgren, and Matt Lundgren called me and said, hey, I want you to be part of the Chick Band. And there are different songs that I learned at different points in all these places, and the thing's going dark. And they were all because I had relationships with these people. So as we go on, and I'm going to tell you about some resources and things that can help you, but I want you to get this idea that the who and the how of multicultural worship always have to stay connected. And part of the reason why that's such a big deal for me, I'm a word nerd, and I noticed that who and how, they're, oh wow, the computer's getting all wonky. Who and how are they're anagrams, right? They're the same letters. So I really want you to get that. Methods always need to connect to relationships when you're talking about multicultural worship. That was the point of my whole thing. And that's part of the reason why I'm here in front of you. I want to get to know some of you guys a little bit better. And no, we're not always going to be at the same churches. We're not always going to be doing leadership matrix. But I want us to be able to learn how to connect with one another and learn how to share with one another and extend bridges. Because that's the way that this multicultural worship thing works. It's not just a result of getting great info and then enacting it and, you know, being awesome and cool like a boss and working it out, but it's in relationship. So you need to get that. Now, the second thing is that once you've connected your methods to relationship, wow, the computer's being really slow. You need to understand that relationship connects to leadership. It'll get there eventually. Oh, whoops, I went one too far. Relationships should connect to leadership. So if you have a relationship with a church leader, that's great. That means that your relationship should influence that church's leadership. And if you are a church leader or a worship leader, the relationships that you have with the people who are working and serving underneath or alongside you should impact the way that you lead. But here's the thing that really struck me one day, is that if you don't have multicultural leadership, that what you can do, if you're doing multicultural worship but you don't have multicultural leadership, then it can morph into something we call tokenism. And what tokenism says is, you know, I like a little piece of your culture, so I just want, just give me, you know, like a quarter's worth. And I just want that. I don't really want you and all your hopes and dreams and all your issues. That's too much. I can't handle that. Just give me like a little bit. And the thing is, tokenism is not like, honestly, it's kind of a harsh word. Like, it's not a word that we want to really hear that often. But the truth is, I've been to a lot of different churches. Some of them covenant churches, some of them non-denominational churches, churches of all different backgrounds. And a lot of times when I see people talking about multicultural worship, they may have an approach that involves different cultures, but it is not truly multicultural in its leadership. And you know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of the UPS truck. Because you can have a lot of brown on the outside, but if all the influence coming from the top is white, then it's not totally the same. And the reason why I said that whole thing about relationship is because it's easy-ish to pick someone who doesn't look like you and say, hey, we want you to sing on the worship team with us. You know, but it's a lot different from saying, hey, you're someone that doesn't look like us in the worship team. I want to know, what kind of music really speaks to you in your heart? What kind of music do you listen to when you're not in church? What kind of music would really set your heart ablaze if you showed up on a Sunday morning and we were singing this song? Those are really different questions. And I went through that whole thing about multicultural worship to help you to understand that multicultural worship, I believe, is a huge way, a huge shift in the way that the church is beginning to move. But if we don't get some of these ideas, particularly the one about relationship, then it can be easy to do damage without even trying. And I don't want anybody to walk away from this thinking to myself, well, that's it. I'm never, you know, I don't know how to do that thing with the keyboards, and I'm not going to offend anybody, so let me just step back and just, you know, keep singing the songs I like and the songs I know. That's not the point. The point is, if we're really going to be the body of Christ and be together, then we got to get to know one another. And we got to be able to share our hurts and our frustrations. And out of that sense of community, that's when multicultural worship can really arise and thrive and be the testimony of God's redemptive grace in action that the church is supposed to be. And I believe multicultural worship is a huge way to do that. So, in wrapping things up, I've got a couple resources to share with you. And then I'm going to open the floor for questions, and then I'm going to let you go because we only have about 7 minutes left. So I alluded to both of these resources, but I just want to tell you more. explicitly what they are, what they're about, and you don't need to write them down because they're also on the sheet here. But the first one is Motif Worship. So that's the name of the website that I started. So the tracks that I use, when you came in here and there was music playing, that music was playing, those were examples of arrangements that I put together of common worship songs that people like. And I figured out how to play them and do them on a Yamaha Motif keyboards and make them sound interesting and different, unlike most things that you hear in church. So if you want to know more about how that goes and how to do that, and how to sort of get into that sort of stream of multicultural worship, go to my website, motifworship.org. Get on the mailing list. You can find out all kinds of stuff about it. We're going to be making an album. We're doing a Kickstarter. It's going to be great. We're going to get some more keyboards and do some trainings and get some people together and really get into the nuts and bolts about it. And maybe I can even do one of those here at Leadership Matrix. But I just wanted you to know that first one. The second one I also alluded to, the Multicultural Worship Leaders Network. If you go to mwln.org, you can find profiles of all of us, but also it's a great opportunity for you to get resources, for you to find out about songs and new CDs and events. So I told people, I told people that on that list that I was going to be, here at Leadership Matrix. But the truth is, I'm one of the only people that's in the Pacific Northwest, but you have worship leaders in Texas and Florida and Maryland and Chicago, and we have a Facebook group. And so you can be a part of this Facebook group and sort of get to hear all these different stories. And so if you want more resources about that, there's the Multicultural Worship Leaders Network. Also, I didn't make a cool little graphic for it, but I wanted to tell you about it. There is a Covenant Worship Leaders Facebook group called Better Together. That's how I know Dan here. And the Better Together group, it is primarily for worship leaders, but if you are a Covenant worship leader and you really want to be engaged in an ongoing dialogue about what some of these issues are, you can ask to be a part of the group, and I know, come shake my hand and introduce yourself, and then I'll know you, and then, when you're on Facebook and you want to be part of the group, then I'll say, oh yeah, I know them, let them in. It'll be all good. Also, there's a Worship Connect blog that the Covenant Church produces, and it's a blog, so it's not a Facebook group, but the Worship Connect blog also talks about a lot of these kind of issues, and in fact, we just had a really big, long discussion about some stuff, and it's on the blog now.
The blog just went up about a half hour before we started.
Yeah, exactly. So, so if you go to the Worship Connect blog, and I should have written that down on the thing, but ask Dan or ask me afterwards. I can tell you how to get to it. That's another great place to find resources and to sort of get your feet wet and more involved and to get connected relationally.
You don't have to be a member of the Better Together Facebook group to read the blog.
Correct. Yeah, and that's the other thing. Thank you for saying that. So the Better Together Facebook group is a Facebook group that is primarily for worship leaders, but the Worship Connect blog, it's a blog, so it's open to anybody. So if you're just one of those people that you're not an active practitioner of worship, but you just sort of want to get an idea and get your finger on the pulse of the new trends and ideas and issues that are floating around in worship music, check out the Covenant Worship blog, Covenant Connect blog. So that's most of what I had for you today. As we leave, there are two questions that I have for you to consider. And I'm not asking you to answer this now because we're almost done, and I want to give at least a few time for Q&A. But I want you to think about this, because remember, this is not just for the purpose of having your mind blown and walking away and then doing nothing. So I believe that God had you here for a purpose, and so I want you to consider these two questions. First, what's in your hand? If we go back to the story of David, what was in his hand? A slingshot and some rocks. If we think about Moses leading the children of Israel across the Red Sea, God said to Moses, Moses, what's in your hand? And God saw what was in his hand, and he used that. He used that staff. And I believe that God has put something in your hand. I don't know what it is. I know what was in my hand. What's in my hand is a big 61-key Yamaha keyboard. That's what's in my hand. But maybe it's something different for you. So that's the first question. What's in your hand? Secondly, who's in your circle? If the who and how are really going to be intertwined, then it's not enough to just say, well, I saw this thing on Motif Worship and I want to do some of those cool tracks. But take account. Who's in your circle? Who's around you? Think about the diversity group. Think about the people that God has put around you and in your circle, and ask him how those people can help change your worship, make it more diverse. So I want to take about 30 seconds for you to think about that. And then in the 2 minutes or so we have left, I'll take a few questions.